Greetings, Lost Traveler. Today, we're going to be talking about how video games are able to create a sense of suspense through the narrative, world building, and sound design within the video game Inscription. But before we go any further, we must understand the meaning of suspense. In the case of video games, and according to Merriam-Webster, it is the mental uncertainty that the video game creates within the player as they play through the game. This allows for a deeper interconnectivity of the player and the game's narrative by keeping the player constantly immersed. This all boils down to one thing that all games nowadays pride themselves on, and that's the interactivity when within the game for the player. With the rising of open worlds and larger maps, as well as game industries wanting bigger and better, video games have also been pushing for more and more interactivity with the player and their environments in order to give players better immersion within the game. With this knowledge, players that pick up these games will attempt to explore the world their own way, which is how developers intended it to be. However, it is within the removal of interactivity for the player at key points within a video game that can truly generate the best feelings of suspense. Written and created by Jonathan Fromm and Aaron Smuts, they state, "We argue that video games can be most effective in generating suspense not by highlighting their unique ability to be interactive, but to the contrary, by limiting interactivity at key points, thereby turning players into helpless spectators. Our analysis highlights a previously overlooked factor in film's ability to generate suspense: helplessness." After now knowing how suspense is generated within video games, we can take a look at Inscription and how it is able to convey these feelings. Created by Daniel Mullen Games and published by Devolver Digital, Inscription is a horror deck-building roguelike game that takes the player down a choose-your-path style gameplay. The horror aspect of the game can be more akin to psychological horror than traditional jump-scare horror. I say this because the game never truly has a moment that jumps out or scares you, but it instead builds upon its own world, causing the player to question just what is going on within the game. The game immediately thrusts the player in and starts to create feelings of mental uncertainty. Across from the player sits a looming figure with eyes that swirl orange when talking. Instead of a traditional human voice, the player hears a deep, unsettling bass. As the player plays the game, they begin to understand that sacrifices must be made in order to win, forcing the player to constantly sacrifice their cards. A few cards will speak and share dialogue as well, creating and building upon the narrative story and its world. The player is also able to move around the small cabin-like room and are able to interact with a few objects. The player can't leave themselves, so in the end they must sit down and play again. Some objects scattered around the room don't seem to mean anything, however they instead foreshadow items, cards, and events that will happen further into the story. This further establishes the helplessness that the player should be feeling. Although they are able to move around the room, that is it. There is nothing else. It is only the room, and so they must continue playing. This drives the player to continue on in an attempt to beat the looming figure and finally escape. The player can also obtain items, however there are two odd items out. The first, a pair of pliers, and the second, a knife. The game doesn't initially tell the player what the items do, so using them is the only way to learn. Upon using the knife for the first time, I was shocked, while wincing and cringing as I see my character stabbing their eye out. Stabbing an eye out is something that most people would not do, and would probably stop if they had the chance, but because they use the item itself, it is out of the player's hands. Upon removal of your eye, the being will offer a new eye, as the screen will be distorted and hard to see out of. It presents a chest of eyes, with one noticeably standing out with a glowing teal color. Selecting this eye brings up hidden texts and words that were unable to see before. This builds upon the game's narrative, as well as gives the player many questions and fills them with suspense of the future of the game. At the first boss, the entire atmosphere of the room changes. Trees are added, as well as the music changes to a deep piano with an echoing of a pickaxe hitting rock in the back. The figure across from the table now dons a creepy mask, calling themselves the Prospector. The atmosphere and the mood that is created through the settings and the music provide suspense for the player in a way that other literary devices are unable to convey due to the player's deep immersion within the game. Through strict audio-visual interactions, music is pushed beyond standard narrative design aspects of time and place into a symbiotic sensory relationship with the on-screen action. Music in horror settings is rarely used as incidental backing music. Instead, It is intended to convey atmospheric moods and provide sonic instructions to the players. There's a sequence near the end that I believe truly takes the feelings of suspense, helplessness, and uncertainty and displays them all perfectly. Further in, there is a boss called the Archivist.zip. This boss is one that uses the player's hard drive in the battle, and will ask the player to give file access to the game, with either answer turning into yes when being hovered over. The player must then go through their own files and choose a file that is very old, which is usually a file that is held closer and more dear to a person, due to the file's age. Upon choosing a file, the player is told that if the file dies in the game, it will be permanently removed from the computer. This is a perfect example of how suspense, helplessness, and uncertainty are created within the game, due to the player being forced to open their own hard drive while not trying to lose their files. The player knows that the game needs hard drive access in order to play, however, the game tricks the player into believing that the file will truly be destroyed due to the lie of giving access. It may be a game, but as the game goes on, the line between real and fake starts to blur, and the player begins to doubt themselves on what's real and fake within the game. With the rising of video game industries, games that question players' reality through the usage of psychological methods are marginally more immersive due to the player being directly in their controllable character's shoes, as well as being able to instill helplessness through the removal of interactivity. The individual experience for each player shows that psychological horror aspects in games not only strengthen the player's immersion through the suspense and removal of interactivity, but also through the narrative, world building, and the music that is used to shape the feelings of suspense that should be explored more in video games as technology improves.